Hello students, and welcome to episode 2 of how to integrate your quotations inside of your writing. This video is going to cover what I call the quoting formula. I'm going to share 3 very simple tips to help you integrate your quotations and comment on them so that you can be a more effective writer. Following this formula is instantly going to make you a much stronger writer because it's going to allow you to even write more in your paragraph and elaborate and analyze and use better quotes than you ever have before. So let's get started. The formula is as follows. Introduce the quote the quote, then comment on the quote. I'm going to repeat this a few times throughout this video. Introduce the quote the quote, then you comment on the quote. So it has a bit of a ring to it. Memorize this, get it into your heads, because if you follow this every time you use direct evidence, direct quotations, you're going to be much better off in your paper. We have already covered introducing the quote in a previous video, so you can go ahead and click on it if you have not watched it yet. But ultimately, to sum it up, a quote can never stand alone. So we're going to really deal with the second part of this formula, quoting the quote. So you need to know a few things with quoting the quote. Short quotes are oftentimes going to be better than longer ones, but generally speaking, if you are supposed to write a 5-page paper or less, you don't want super long quotes because your teacher wants to hear more from you and less from other people. Number 2, the quote that you use needs to support you and your argument. The quote comes secondary to everything else. And number 3, sometimes a paraphrase is actually better than a quote. This is an example of why short quotes are oftentimes better than longer ones. So this student wrote a decent paper. It was about 2 or 3 pages in length, but a lot of their quotes were similar to this. As you can see, it takes up 3+ lines, and even in a Google Doc, it's about 2 or 3 lines. So a good rule of thumb is if the quote that you're using takes up a full 2 lines or more, then you should probably cut it in half somehow. Or take part 1 of the quote and part 2 of the quote and separate them within your own words. Find a way of diversifying them a little bit more. Find a way of lengthening your paragraph and spreading out parts of this quote further. And now this is another example of what a student did. As you can see, this is their full paragraph here, and the highlighted portion is the quote that they used. Now this was actually an entire paragraph, so there are some other issues with this. It does need to be a lengthier paragraph, but notice just even visually, look how much space somebody else's words make up their own paragraph. So this would have actually been much better if they spread this out throughout this paragraph and actually added more sentences to what they were saying. And now we come to a third example. Once again, this is a full paragraph that a student wrote, and look at the highlighted portion. It still takes up a lot of real estate in this student's paragraph. So another person's words are doing most of the work for them. As you can see as well, this one quotation that they use is actually 2 sentences. I don't want to leave you guys just seeing some negative examples, so here's actually a positive one. So as you can see here, it's visually very different than the other 3 examples. The highlighted portions are spread out throughout this paragraph, and they are shorter. There's only one that's getting to a second line. So the student says the poem first promotes reading a piece by pressing an ear against its hive, as if the work were buzzing with emotion and volume that could be found easily. Another way is to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. And then the student goes on further, and then at the end saying, by stating people, quote, torture a confession out of it. Notice this is a very targeted approach to using quotations in one paragraph. They could have bunched it all together and made it one little section that took up 3 lines, but it's actually more effective to spread out the ideas and use the evidence in this way. So now that we dealt with why shorter quotes are often better, we now need to deal with why quotes need to support your argument and be secondary and not just advance some type of plot summary. One of the biggest traps I see a lot of students doing is they do find evidence, but it's not really evidence. It's more so just quotes that they found that help them write more in their paragraph, but it's not actually saying anything. It's all smoke and mirrors. So this is one example here of a student writing a literary analysis on The Yellow Wallpaper, a short story. And as you can see, the highlighted portion shows the quote. Although this student knew that they needed to use evidence in this paragraph, this isn't actually evidence. All this does is advance this person's plot summary further. This does not prove anything about the stereotypical view of women. This does not support the topic sentence at all. Instead, it furthers the summary that he was giving of how this woman is stuck in a room and she's told to stay put. And then he just adds in from the story, the narrator says, "I don't like our room one bit." It would have actually been much better off for them to just summarize that part instead of actually directly quoting it, because this is just fluff. It's not adding any substance. It's not supporting an argument. Instead, it's just advancing and adding more words into a paragraph. Your quotes need to support your topic sentence. Your quotes need to support your thesis. And if they don't, scrap it. Throw it in the trash. Additionally, if you can paraphrase a quote, sometimes it's better to just do that. This student could have put this quote into his own words because he kind of already did that in the sentences previously. So it definitely needs to be cleaned up a bit. Just scrap it all together, sweep it out of the way. Another example here, as you can see visually, this quote is on the lengthier side. It's borderline, but again, the issue here more so is that it's not advancing an argument. And notice, what did this quote actually do for us? It didn't do anything. They even prefaced it by saying that the narrator explains this stuff about the town. But so what? What does this have to do with the topic sentence? What does this have to do with some type of argument? Instead, it just takes up space. And this could have been paraphrased instead of directly quoted. So look at the quotes that you're integrating, and especially if they're longer ones, ask yourself, can I spread them out? And also, is it supporting my argument, or is it just taking up too much space, doing nothing? So this leads to our last point, and my favorite part of the quoting formula. We have introduced the quote, and then comment on the quote. You always need to explain the significance of the quote that you're using. That's the issue that a lot of students previously that I showed in this slide had. And you should never end a paragraph with a quote. And that rule shouldn't even be stated, because if you follow rule number 1, you will never fall into rule number 2, because you always need to follow up a quote with explaining the significance of why it's even in there. You do not want your readers or even your teachers to have to interpret the quote themselves. You need to state exactly why you're using that evidence. You need to connect it back to your topic sentence and your thesis statement, because it's support for your argument. So here's an example of what I mean here. So in yellow, you have the quotes, and in blue, you're going to see that it is the comment on the quote. So this student said he was so set on following his religion that nothing but physical inability to move was allowed to obstruct or postpone this visit. These visits and their importance to Wieland shows that he was obsessed with his beliefs. Obsession, or thinking about something over and over, can be very harmful. The more he paid these visits, the more his happiness decreased. Notice that the blue part is mainly analysis, and you can see in the green highlight the verb shows. It's an expression saying that this student is about to explain the significance of the quote that they used. They're saying this is significant because it's showing something specific that's not stated directly in the text. They're taking the connotations of the words and the connotations and the meaning of that sentence and of that quote, and they're saying this is what it really means. And they're telling me specifically, so they did a great job with that. Here's another example. Brown describes him as, quote, much conversant with the history of religious opinions and took pains to ascertain their validity. This meant that. That's a good signifying phrase telling us that this student is about to explain the significance of their quote. This meant that he focused on a religion by attempting to further prove its truthfulness. Like his father, he was also obsessed with following what he thought was truth. That is analysis. That is what we want to see. If you use a quote, you must follow it up with your own words, explaining the significance and analyzing it more. Some of the most useful phrases you can use right after a quote to show significance is words like "this shows," "this reveals," "this is significant because." There's a lot more you can pick from, but these are top 3 that I see working effectively consistently. So go ahead and take any one of them, and after you quote something, say "this shows," and then give the explanation and the analysis. "This reveals," and then the analysis. "This is significant because," and then the analysis. Now I do want to note that this falls in line with a model of writing, and it's called the TPAC Model. Now, it's an acronym, stands for topic, sentence, evidence, paraphrase of the evidence or the context of it, analysis of evidence, and the concluding sentence. So this model is great to follow because if you do this, you can write a very robust paragraph. And I'm going to show you an example that comes from a free download on Teachers Pay Teachers by Writing with Miss Wu. As you can see here, there's a lot of highlights. The red is the topic sentence. The yellow is the paraphrase and the context. The orange highlight is the direct quotation. And then the green is the analysis of the quotation, and the pink-purple color is the concluding sentence. And notice this is a robust paragraph, and they introduce the quote. The quote that she used, also pretty small. Look at how much her own words take up this space. This is what your paragraphs ultimately want to look like. And they followed the quoting formula. Look at the comment. Even though he did kill Mr. Yule, it is evidence that he had the right motives behind protecting the 2 children who he had grown to care for. Because he had no malicious intention, it would be sinful to expose the very reclusive man to such hardship by making him endure a trial. That is analysis. So this is what your paragraphs should really look like when you're done with them. There should be much more of your words than there are of somebody else's. Yes, quotes are great to use, but you don't want to overuse them or abuse them. So just remember the quoting formula. Introduce the quote the quote, and then you comment on the quote.